I had lived among shadows of her life for weeks, unnoticed glances, subtle absences, cryptic messages. And then, in a restaurant, the threads converged. Emily Joshua Caitlin. The betrayal unfolded in slow motion. I didn't intervene. I simply watched, letting the silence speak louder than any accusation. I woke up to the same gray light spilling through the blinds, the city breathing quietly outside my window. The alarm went off at exactly 6:15 a.m., and I followed the routine I had long stopped thinking about. Shower, shave, tie, coffee brewed just enough to burn the first sip and warm the cup in my hands. The kitchen smelled faintly of last night's dishes, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the space like a metronome. Emily was already gone, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume on the counter, her laptop bag gone, the apartment suddenly hollow. I grabbed my coat and keys and stepped into the small backyard. The grass was still damp from the morning frost, the neighbors' houses lined up like silent sentinels. I nodded at a man walking his dog, a nod returned without conversation, a ritual as automatic as my own commute. The L train station was 5 blocks away, and the walk felt like a countdown, each step bringing me closer to the predictable rhythm of the day. The train rattling down the tracks like a clock, like the pulse of the city itself. Coffee in a paper cup, laptop balanced against my chest. I merged with the stream of commuters. Phones tapped, earbuds in, eyes down. Emails, spreadsheets, the endless grind of reports and updates consumed the hours until lunch. The office smelled of stale coffee and printer toner, the hum of fluorescent lights above. I moved through it all with quiet efficiency, a background presence in the machinery of my own life. When I finally returned home, the townhouse greeted me like a set piece, familiar and sterile. Emily's side of the bed was empty, her work bag gone, the kitchen spotless. I made dinner out of habit, not hunger, plating food on clean dishes, eating while scrolling through messages I didn't care to respond to. The couch felt wide and unwelcoming, the walls holding echoes of laughter that no longer existed. Nights blurred into mornings, conversations reduced to brief logistics. The sound of Emily moving through the house replaced the warmth we had once shared. I noticed it most in the bed, in the way we lay facing away from each other, a chasm measured in inches and silence. Hands that had once sought one another now rested quietly on their own sides. Every morning, every evening, every repetition built an invisible wall. I told myself it was just busy schedules, stress, the nature of modern marriage. But even in my denial, I felt the subtle drift, the small fractures where comfort had once been, the quiet erosion of intimacy, the accumulation of distance that I did not yet know how to confront. I began noticing things I had once dismissed, small shifts that seemed trivial at first, almost invisible. Emily's work hours stretched later, her silhouette disappearing behind the office door long after I had finished my own day. Her phone was never lying openly on the counter anymore. Calls went to another room, voices muted, tones carefully measured. At first, I told myself it was just professionalism, ambition, a woman building her career, and I wanted to be proud. But pride didn't fill the silence that crept into our evenings. The calendar became a strange map, marked with cryptic entries I didn't recognize. Client dinner, late-night meeting, out-of-town presentation. I tried to reconcile the notes with the occasional receipts left lying around, charges for restaurants and hotels that didn't match any memory I had. Each discrepancy felt like a loose thread in the fabric of our life. I told myself it was nothing, coincidences, the pace of modern work life. Yet I started noticing patterns, too consistent to ignore entirely. Dinners grew quieter. We would sit in the kitchen or at the dining table, plates in front of us, eating in parallel rather than together. Words were exchanged only when necessary, schedules, bills, chores. Laughter that once filled the corners of the living room became distant, forced, or absent entirely. Even the children's playful noises felt muted, echoes in a home that seemed suddenly larger, colder. I found myself lingering on small details, the tilt of her chair at the office, the quick glance at a screen when I entered the room, the way she answered texts with careful brevity. My own journal became a repository of mundane notes, dates, times, locations, brief observations. It was a quiet obsession, a way to give shape to the unease that had begun to gnaw at me. Each note, each calculation, felt like a piece of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to complete. Even in my denial, the emptiness pressed in. I had convinced myself that work consumed her energy, that late nights were just part of life. But instinct was growing louder. The subtle signals, the gaps between us, were no longer easily ignored. I started tracing sequences, lining up events against each other in my mind, connecting the dots of seemingly ordinary days. The house held more shadows than light now, and I felt myself shrinking into the spaces where connection had once lived, waiting, watching, and trying to understand the truth hidden behind the routine. I started noticing the pattern in pieces I had once overlooked, small details that had seemed random now aligning with a quiet insistence. Emily mentioned Joshua more than casually, his name threading through conversations, offhand remarks about projects, collaborative wins, or client strategies. At first, it felt innocent, professional. But as I traced dates on the calendar and cross-checked with her receipts, the coincidences began to accumulate. Restaurants and hotels appeared repeatedly, coinciding precisely with evenings Joshua was scheduled to be at client dinners or late-night meetings. The numbers didn't lie, and the repetition carved a hollow in my chest I could no longer ignore. I moved carefully, documenting silently, treating every detail as evidence rather than confrontation. I didn't pick up her phone. I didn't ask her directly. I kept track of the late nights, the subtle shifts in tone, the way she positioned herself in the house differently on those evenings. Each observation built upon the last, a lattice of signs that pointed toward something I had been too polite or too distracted to see before. The quiet consistency of it frightened me, but also clarified what my gut had been whispering for weeks. The step that followed was one I approached with hesitation. I reached out to Caitlin, Joshua's wife, seeking clarity without accusation. Her responses were measured, hesitant, but the facts she shared mirrored my own observations. Late arrivals, vague explanations, guarded phones, minor excuses that felt more deliberate than accidental. She, too, had noted the same misalignments, the same inexplicable absences, the same protective secrecy. The convergence of our findings confirmed what I had feared and yet needed to know. My instincts had not deceived me. Holding that confirmation was a peculiar sensation. Part of me felt relief in knowing I was not imagining it, that the unease had a concrete source. Yet alongside that relief ran an undercurrent of dread, a recognition that knowing was only the first step. The truth awaited, and I had not yet confronted it. The house, once a quiet sanctuary of routine, felt heavier now, as if it were pressing in with all the secrets it had silently witnessed. I continued to record, to observe, every gesture, every absence, preparing for the moment when the pattern I had pieced together would demand acknowledgement. The awareness altered the rhythm of my days. Even mundane actions, brewing coffee, folding laundry, walking to the train, were filtered through a lens of scrutiny. The world seemed sharper, more precise, as I cataloged intersections between schedules, receipts, and fleeting glimpses of behavior. I was no longer a man passively living in the routines of marriage. I had become a quiet archivist of truth, mapping the contours of a reality I had feared, and waiting for the inevitable confrontation with what the data and instinct together had begun to reveal. I arrived at the restaurant early, moving through the streets of Lakeview with a quiet precision, rehearsing the night in my mind, noting every detail of the route, every corner where a glance might reveal something unnoticed before. The air was crisp, the city lights bouncing off the wet pavement from a brief afternoon drizzle, reflecting the kind of calm that masked tension perfectly. Inside, the restaurant exuded the ordinary, low music, the clink of glasses, the murmur of diners. Yet beneath the veneer of normalcy, I felt every heartbeat sharpen, every breath measured. I waited, watching the door, absorbing the familiar rhythm of the place, noting the way the waitstaff moved, the placement of tables, the soft glow from the lamps, everything seemingly inconsequential, everything a stage for the truth I had been anticipating. Time elongated, each second a drawn-out pulse in my chest, every tick of the clock marking the approach of the inevitable. When Emily entered, she moved with effortless grace, yet there was a subtle difference in her posture, the set of her shoulders, the sway of her stride. The scent of a new perfume reached me before her eyes met mine, and the subtle alteration from the warmth of home to a colder, more deliberate presentation made the space between us tangible. She smiled politely, a rehearsed civility, and took her seat across from me. The quiet intensity of her presence filled the air, each gesture precise, measured. Minutes stretched, filled with the hum of nearby conversations, the clatter of cutlery, but all of it felt distant, muffled by the thrum of awareness in my own chest. I didn't need words to sense the shift, to feel the culmination of weeks of observation and unease. Then the door opened again, and Joshua entered, followed by Caitlin, their presence commanding attention without ceremony. The ordinary scene of a dinner was suddenly charged with gravity. Everything slowed. I saw Joshua's measured steps, the casual ease that had seemed innocent from afar, now marked by intention. Caitlin's eyes scanned the room, catching mine briefly, a flicker of recognition, a shared understanding that both of us had been watching, noting, waiting. Emily's composure faltered imperceptibly, a hesitation in movement, a shift in gaze, subtle tremors that betrayed the facade she had maintained. The full picture settled in around me. Every late night, every guarded glance, every unexplained transaction crystallized into a single, undeniable reality. The patterns I had tracked, the suspicions I had catalogued, the uneasy moments I had buried under routine, they were no longer abstractions. They existed now in 3 dimensions, unfolding in real time, manifesting in the posture, expressions, and movements of the people I had once trusted implicitly. The room itself seemed to contract, the city beyond the window a silent witness to the truth. I felt the tension coil in my shoulders, in my hands, in the pit of my stomach, an amalgam of dread, clarity, and inevitability. The lie I had sensed, that slow, quiet erosion of honesty and intimacy, now presented itself without disguise. In that suspended moment, I understood the weight of observation, the power of patience, and the inescapable confrontation with reality. The inevitable had arrived, and there was no turning away. I watched without moving, without speaking, letting the scene unfold with an almost clinical attention. Emily's composure wavered in small, telling ways, subtle shifts in posture, the flicker of her eyes, the tight press of her lips, a recognition of exposure she could no longer hide. Joshua's confidence faltered too, the ease he had carried for weeks eroding under the weight of revelation, the careful mask cracking. Caitlin's presence was equally precise, her realization quiet but absolute, as if a story she had long believed in had suddenly ended, leaving only fragments. I catalogued every nuance, every micro-expression, as though recording them on a mental ledger. The laughter that had once been easy now sounded hollow, the smiles forced, the gestures mechanical. Nothing could be undone. No glance or word could rewrite the pattern that had been revealed. My role was silent observation, the restraint of inaction, my way of asserting control, of preserving my dignity in the face of betrayal. The emptiness I had felt for months, the absence in our shared meals, the hollow echo in evening conversations, the space between us in bed, manifested itself in full clarity in that moment. The illusions of our life together crumbled simultaneously with the illusions of others, leaving a raw, exposed reality. I felt the room contract around the weight of truth, each heartbeat a reminder that what had been was irretrievably lost. In that stillness, I acknowledged the end of what I had believed in, the loss of intimacy and trust. And yet there was a strange liberation in this recognition. Pain and release coexisted in the same pulse, a rhythm that marked both grief and the first step toward reclaiming myself. I understood that my task was not confrontation, not dramatics, but the quiet maintenance of my own presence, the careful preservation of my identity unshaken by the collapse around me. I left the observation to do its work, letting the silence between us weigh heavier than any accusation. Each detail was etched into memory, the tension in shoulders, the fleeting glances, the faltering steps, the realization in eyes. All of it formed a ledger of finality. My dignity remained intact because I chose to witness without engagement, to measure without retaliation, to endure without surrendering the core of who I was. The room faded around me, the city beyond the windows irrelevant, the soft hum of life continuing without pause. Inside, a quiet reckoning settled, the understanding that the past had ended and that the space once filled with shared life was now mine alone to navigate. I felt the first surge of clarity, the beginning of control returning, the faint but undeniable sensation of liberation that followed absolute recognition. The price of silence was full understanding, and I paid it willingly. I moved out of the house that had once felt like a fortress and a cage at the same time, watching the familiar streets of Chicago recede as I handed over the keys and closed the door for the last time. The loft I found on the edge of the city was smaller, stripped of the weight of old memories, but it felt honest, a space where my own presence defined the rhythm. Each morning I woke to light spilling across bare floors, to the sound of distant traffic, and to the calm certainty that the past no longer dictated my movements. Work shifted too. Tasks that had once felt mechanical now carried a clarity I had never noticed before. Each decision grounded in my own reasoning, rather than in expectations or routine. I began to fill the gaps in my days with walks along quiet streets, afternoons with books that drew me into other worlds, and occasional trips to nearby towns, observing lives that moved at a pace and pattern foreign yet invigorating. The world outside my apartment became a measure of freedom, and I discovered that stillness could be as expansive as noise, that silence was a companion rather than a void. Emily continued along her path, and Joshua and Caitlin found their own ways into new lives, but none of their footsteps crossed mine. The patterns I had once traced in their behaviors no longer mattered. The ledger of observation closed with their absence. I relied on my intuition, trained in months of careful attention, and allowed it to guide me, noticing the subtle shifts in my environment, the small acts that brought peace, the details that nurtured my own sense of order. I learned to value boundaries, to protect my time and energy without guilt, to honor solitude as an opportunity rather than a punishment. The days were no longer filled with the illusion of stability, the pretense of control over others, or the fragile comfort of shared life. Instead, they were structured around honesty. Honesty with myself, my thoughts, my emotions, and the quiet knowledge that the choices I made were for me alone. The loft became a sanctuary of growth. I walked through it as though each step was a test, measuring my progress in small increments, in the ability to sit with myself without distraction, to read, to write, to notice the light shifting across the walls. Silence became rich, layered with reflection and understanding, with a new awareness of my own resilience. I no longer feared the spaces between people, the absence of conversation, or the nights spent alone. I embraced them, recognizing that solitude carried the weight of possibility, that life could be measured by depth rather than by appearances. In time, I felt a quiet strength settle within me. I moved through mornings and evenings with a sense of integrity, each action rooted in the recognition of my own value. I no longer sought validation or affirmation from those who had once shared my life. The past, with all its betrayal and emptiness, was a reference, not a chain. I began to shape my own patterns, to create routines that reflected my own priorities and desires. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, I realized that this was a new life, untainted by illusion, grounded in the self I had reclaimed. Trusting my intuition, observing with care, and honoring my own boundaries became the cornerstones of my existence. I moved forward with the quiet knowledge that my world was mine to protect, my decisions mine to make, and my peace mine to cultivate. In the stillness of the loft, in the measured pace of my days, I discovered the most essential truth, that life, stripped of pretense and distraction, could be lived fully, and with an honesty I had never allowed myself before.